There's a special class of questions that ask you to identify what role a specific line plays in an argument. While these kinds of questions may seem intimidating, they're actually incredibly simple because they rely on only one key skill, and that is your ability to identify the conclusion. If you need to, go back and watch our conclusions video again, or at least review the clue words, the key words that can indicate the conclusion. One of those clue words is the word yet. Remember, contrast words, words like but, yet, however. That means the passage is changing gears, and frequently that's where the author puts the conclusion. So in this case, our conclusion is black bears have also played an important role in this decline. Next, we simply have to identify whether the bolded portion or the portion the question is asking us about, whether this line is either supporting the conclusion, going against the conclusion, or sometimes it may even be the conclusion itself. So in this case, that part of the passage says, people blame hunters for the decline. And we can see that goes directly against the conclusion that black bears are responsible for the decline. And that should be enough. We know the bolded part goes against the conclusion. We know A is out because the bolded part is not the main conclusion. We know B is out because the conclusion is not explaining the bolded portion. C is definitely out because we've already established the conclusion thinks the bolded part is not correct. Likewise with D, the bolded part does not support the main conclusion of the argument. It goes against it. That leaves us with E, and E makes sense because definitely the conclusion opposes the bolded portion. Incidentally, the word argument is just another word for the main conclusion. Let's try one more. Again, our first step is to identify the conclusion. In this case, we have a couple of clues. Again, we have our contrast word, however, that means our conclusion is nearby. We also have this great word, since, our reason indicator, and since our reason indicator came in the middle of our sentence, the conclusion is the first part of that same sentence. So in this case, such reasoning might well be over-optimistic. That's our conclusion. And the first bold that comes after that, because of our reason indicator, obviously supports our conclusion. And that should be all we have to know about the second bold, that it simply supports our conclusion. Now, when we look at our conclusion, we see a pronoun such. When you see a pronoun in a conclusion, it's important to identify what that pronoun is referring to. In this case, the such reasoning is referring to the part that says, they reason that those worrisome rumors must be false. Once again, we have another pronoun in our reasoning, those worrisome rumors. So once again, we have to identify what is those referring to. If we go a few lines up, we see that people were worried by rumors that the bank faced an impending financial collapse. But then it says those rumors have been greatly relieved. And why were they relieved? Well, because of this word since, we see that the first bold statement is actually the reason why people have been greatly relieved. If you're feeling a bit lost, the good news is this is about as complicated as it will ever get. So let's clean this up and try one more time. So since executives have been buying their own shares, people who were worried about a financial collapse, they are now relieved. But the author thinks that their relief is over-optimistic. That's the conclusion. And the reason he thinks they're over-optimistic is because of the second bold down here. So the first bold is the reason why people were feeling happy. The conclusion is that they should not feel so happy. And the reason they should not be happy is because of the second bold. And that's enough to answer our question. Now we can easily go through the answer choices and eliminate all of the wrong answers. Answer choice B is easy to eliminate because it says the second bold was the main conclusion of the argument. And we know the conclusion of the argument wasn't even bolded. Answer choice D says the first describes a circumstance the argument as a whole seeks to explain. And while you might think there are parts of the argument that were doing some explaining, if we think back to the conclusion was simply that some people were too optimistic. So the goal of the argument was not to explain anything, but just to conclude that some people might be wrong. By the same logic, we can say E is out as well because the goal was not to explain anything. Now, answer choice A looks pretty good. The second bold was definitely a reason. We knew that because of the word since. And that reason supported doubt about how optimistic people should be. And the first bold definitely was evidence that people were supporting a particular conclusion. Remember, the conclusion that people were excited about was that there would not be a financial collapse. It's important to know a specific word in this case, the word a, because there's a difference between a conclusion and the conclusion. If the answer choice says the conclusion or the argument, that refers to the author's opinion. If the answer choice says a conclusion or a argument, it may refer to the part of the passage that is referring to another person's opinion. So in this case, the first bold was supporting a conclusion. It just happened to be a conclusion that was different from the author's opinion.